I think the most difficult aspect of it is not just understanding the manual. I put myself in the shoes of like a recent graduate from like an undergrad degree, like that was born after the year 2000. Like some of those words are not even around anymore. Like they were used 20, 30 years ago. And maybe someone with a bit more experience can understand what they're referring to. But some of the linguistic of our field has changed significantly over the last 10, 15 years. So maybe the concepts are there. It's just difficult to grasp them because they use different words,
Can you give us some examples?
If you look at the way something that I'm not very enthusiastic about, but we tend to classify strength and put a label to it, like explosive strength, power, speed strength, strength speed. That's more of a way of like, it's a taxonomical approach. We're labeling things and we're putting them in order. But if you look at the original manuals, and it's not just Verkhojanski, it's Bosco, it's Comey, Akinen, there's either strength, which can be maximum isometric force or dynamic force if you look at like weight training or weightlifting, and there's power. There's nothing else in between. Yeah. And there are different variations of like either strength endurance or power endurance. But all these nuances that we have nowadays where we classify things are like strength, speed strength, they make a lot of sense because we have more data to create a classification nowadays that we used to have. But it's still like, strength is strength, like once you label.
I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. When I originally read it, I was like, okay, so wait a minute. If you do this specific movement, and what I've always known about strength and performance is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it's not like, well, you did 12 reps here. If you'd done 8, it would have been strength speed. But now all of a sudden, because you did this, it's speed strength. And it just always felt like more of a concurrent training model, that this was like the spectrum you were trying to hit and the focus. And I think they overcomplicated the shit out of it. And I think Dr. Verkhojanski had a blog or forums, and he was pretty active on some forums before he passed away. So I used to dive in and I would read his forums, and people would ask him these like incredibly fucking nuanced questions, and he would just blast them with like the fucking general. Well, if I do 3 reps here of this and this and this, and I remember he just probably just was like pulling his hair out because the nuanced discussion. He's like, at the end of the day, who are you trying to train? What's the training effect? And is the effect that you are applying resulting in what you want it to do? And that was like what I got from his entire blog. But then I just got, it was just packed with these fucking nerds who just wanted to dive into this like unbelievable level of minutia.
Who weren't training athletes.
Who were all like trying to secret squirrel their own training in the garage, or just didn't have a large population of athletes to work with. But he was super active on it, and it was always very, very interesting. And having read all of his work, man, the one is they used to always refer to him as the father of plyometrics, and he was like the king to like denounce that. He's like, I am not the father of plyometrics. And it was just, there was just a lot of misconceptions, and I just enjoyed reading his the posts.
I agree with you so much. And what fascinates me a lot is that if you truly read the manual and super training and you spend a little bit more time understanding what they're referring to, you'll find references to post-activation potentiation back in the 60s, early 70s. There are data and studies on velocity-based training that are dated before 1970. They pioneered some of the most advanced methods of periodized training that just recently we started to figure it out with research. So everything you really need as a strength and conditioning coach is in those 2 books. Whether you want to say it or not is there. Then it's up to you to be able to like just read outside the box of the constraints of like just wording and phrasing and translating and try to understand what they're describing. You'll find there's so much to it. They didn't have the science yet to explain it all. Like if you look at the way Verkhojanski explains like post-activation potentiation is very much like, it's more like philosophical than scientific. It refers to like an imprinting on the CNS, a potentiating effect of like heavy loading. It doesn't have the science behind it to explain why it's working, but coming from 30 plus years of experience coaching elite level athletes, he knew it worked and he knew how to make it work. So it's very fascinating. Nowadays, we tend to complicate things instead of make them easier with science sometimes.
Yeah, no, post-activation potentiation has been a huge hallmark in all my programs and stuff that I used when I was playing the NFL, even in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was always like something heavy, something dynamic. And it was like if we did a heavy squat, it was a heavy sprint. If it was a heavy pull, it was a heavy jump. So there was always like the something heavy, something dynamic with opposing movements. If you think about a bilateral hip hinge versus this, so it was pretty simple. And we found that like if we could squat a heavy triple and then immediately roll into like an all-out 20-yard sprint, all of a sudden when we came back, the quality of movement was better on the triple and the sprinting was better, opposed from, let's say you did like 6 sets of 3 on the squats, opposed from like 6 sets of 3 on the 20s and did them different or did them separately. So when we started mixing it up and we realized like, oh, post-activation potentiation. I remember when I was training with Roth, I remember it was like maybe 2000, 2001, and he's in there reading Supra training. And he's like, hey, let's give this a shot. And that was where a lot of like our, 20 plus years ago, a lot of training and a lot of stuff came from. A lot of if we're going to do something heavy, we got to do something dynamic. And we still see it today, those roots in our programming.
All right, Antonio, you have had an awesome career. We were introduced thanks to Brian Mann for connecting us just in the random NSCA coaches conference. That's just what happens. Cool people connect. And you were sharing some of your experience, and we got rugby. We got your education as a teacher, what you're researching now. And then one thing I'm excited for you and John to get into is a big motor guy. So F1 guy. How did you end up at USC? And like, let's incorporate your sport and athletic background and really get into it today.
Wow. I'll try to keep it short. Thank you for the question though. I was born and raised in Italy. So I grew up in Italy. My first sport was actually go-karting. I started go-karting when I was 8 years old, and I raced at a fairly decent level up until I was like 14, 15. And I actually started training in a weight room, training in a gym, because after I hit puberty, I gained a lot of weight and I got taller and I was too heavy to race go-karts. So I wanted to lose as much weight as possible. And that's what brought me to the weight room. That's how I started training when I was like I think my mom gave me like my first membership at the gym when I was like 14 years old. And it just happened that as I was getting more into fitness, go-karting became way too expensive for us to be able to afford it. It was always a family business. It was just me and my dad. We never had a professional team. We were doing everything ourselves, from building the go-kart to racing and tuning and everything. I think I built my first engine when I was like 12 with my dad. And when I realized there was no future for me in go-karting, and I was fairly decent at athletics in general, I picked up some track and field training and competitions throughout high school, mostly like sprinting, but I was never good at it. Throwing, I was a little bit better at it. And then getting stronger and getting bigger and getting faster. Some of my friends asked me, why don't you try to play rugby, which is in Italy back then was the only sport where you were allowed to be bigger and stronger. That was fine. That was good. So I did play for a little bit, but I never really got into it to the extent that I should have to become competitive. And one of my good friends back then said like, okay, well, let's try American football, which is a super teeny tiny niche sport in Italy that almost no one practices. But ended up being love at first sight. So I just enjoyed it. I loved it. I played it throughout college for 4 years. After college, I tried to play professional for another 2 or 3 years in Europe with modicum success, nothing crazy. I mean, European football is nothing compared to American football. Like at the best of our days, a good game would look like a bad game in Division 1 in current football. So the level is not super, super high. But the thing that was good and was very motivating for me was that when we were looking at like sheer athleticism and just strength and power and speed, I played against some of the best athletes I've ever came across in Europe. And they were like all from Germany, Austria, Netherlands, like Northern Europe. They were strong. They were fast. I mean, I was my last year of football, I was 315 pounds. And those guys were just as heavy as I was, and they were twice as fast as I was. and they hurt. When they're coming at you, it was not pleasant. But that's how I got into more like strength training and strength and conditioning. I started school as a biology major, but then I quickly switched over physical education just to learn more about strength and conditioning, because we didn't have a strength and conditioning coach. We barely had a coach in American football back then because it was such a little sport with no funding, no money. So we were all like, that was like 2009, 10, 11, where like internet just started to grow in Italy. We were like a little behind the States. So we were just downloading like bigger, faster, stronger routines, or like bodybuilding type of routine. And it was all about like getting bigger, getting stronger, lifting big weights. There was very little like Olympic lifting, was very little plyometrics. It was very old school, raw type of training. And that's how I always felt like that was just simply not right for the way I was like studying in school. And that pushed me to, on one end, like continue my education and try to learn more and get better. And on the other end, just try to train better to be a better athlete. So the two things went hand in hand until early 2013, when like I went on, I worked as a strength coach for the national rugby team for women in Italy. But I wanted to work with American football players. So that's how I ended up eventually moving to the States. And then once I got into the system of like strength and conditioning in NCAA, I did the whole path from like Division 3 to Division 1. And I worked in Canada for a bit. And my last experience coaching full time was actually with a track and field team back in 2016. We trained all the way to the Olympic trials in Oregon, Eugene that year. And that's where like I really realized, I remember we flew to Eugene and we were just all training together on the field in the weight room. There were a lot of athletes from all over the place. And there were also a lot of coaches, and many, many coaches with much more experience than I had. And I thought I knew it all because I made it to the, like coaching at the Olympic trials. It doesn't get any better than that. But then I heard these coaches like talking with their athletes and like explaining things and programming things. And I just realized I knew nothing compared to those guys. And if I wanted to get somewhat better in my profession, I would probably have to pursue more education. And so I kind of like, I don't want to say quit coaching because I still did some coaching on in a private facility, but I went back to school and one thing led to the other. And just here I am now doing a PhD program at USC. So I just switched from 100% practitioner to almost 100% research within the last 5 to 6 years.
Well, a lot of experience to now bring to research. Yeah. And that's something we've spoken where people just finish degree, and they never miss or never take that time to apply.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference once you see like, especially younger students coming out of like undergrad or grad programs. They know very well. They know science very well, but in research, what I've learned, at least in our field, like I'm not speaking for everyone, but at least in the sports science type of field, there's very little that needs to be discovered and reinvented. It's more about like asking the right questions to look at things in the right way and in a way that can translate evidence into practice to improve the way we work with athletes. It's very much, our research has to be applicable. If we just do research for the sake of doing research, our field is not going to change much. We need to be able to ask the right questions and find the right answers for practitioners to improve the way they work with athletes. And that's what I've tried to do since I switched over to more research and less practice. Pretty much every single study I've been part of or I've done started from a question that I asked myself back when I was working and I didn't have an answer for. And now here I am, I want to find the answer. So studies on eccentric training, BFR, we're doing some studies on velocity-based training. Those are all questions that I've had developed working on the field with athletes. And believe it or not, those questions, you develop them when you do your worst mistakes ever. You start questioning yourself because we have all done mistakes along the way. Like that's how you learn, right? But if you can use that experience to formulate questions, and then you have a way to answer this question with the scientific method, then that will change our field for good, I think.
What are some of the studies? I mean, you just briefly glossed over eccentrics, BFR. What are some of the studies that you've done? And more importantly, what are some of the groundbreaking revelations that you can pull out of it?
Studies, we've done quite a good number of studies on different topics. I think the most recent ones are like, we looked at optimal loading for power output in weightlifting derivatives and weightlifting movements. We looked at the acute effect of BFR on power development and rate of force development. But what I'm really interested into, and it's probably the core work for my final dissertation, is the effect of something that is like not very common nowadays in strength and conditioning, which is Supra Maximal eccentric training, which is not the eccentric training that we all learn how to do, even just by reading Poliquin and doing time under tension, where you lift weights that are not excessively heavy, but you control the eccentric to increase time under tension. What I'm referring to is like lifting weights that are like 120, 130% of your 1 rep max, that you can only slow down. You can't come back up from a squat when you're squatting that heavy, or you can't push on a bench press when you're bench pressing that heavy. And what I'm interested in, if we look at the way research approached eccentric training after the 80s, when Akin and Komi were researching this topic, it became an all or nothing type of approach. Like, if you only use eccentric training, supramaximal eccentric training, then you're only going to get stronger in terms of like being able to generate more isometric force, but your performance in dynamic tasks such as jumping or sprinting will probably not change much, because eccentric training per se is not very sport specific. However, there's some good into like adding eccentric training to your routine, which every single study published up until 1982 showed that like 10-20% of your total training volume is more than enough to do eccentric training. And there's benefit that comes with an extra degree of structural adaptation that you don't get when you don't lift those big weights. And for structural adaptation, I'm looking at mostly changing active and passive stiffness. So your muscle and the connective tissue within changes in response to more mechanical damage. And the only way to increase mechanical damage is to lift bigger weights. And if you want to lift the bigger weights you possibly can handle, you have to do that eccentrically. And that's where my research lies on, like looking at what happens at the molecular level in response to eccentric training, looking at overall connective tissue. So like basic anatomy that we learn in school, like epimysium, endomysium, perimysium, if that connective tissue changes, but also within the cytoskeleton of muscle cells, if there's a response that, and that's what I'm finding out just by doing like basic literature review, a change in tidine contents, which is a protein that allows your muscle to store and use elastic energy more efficiently. So if I can improve stiffness, active and passive stiffness, means that I can improve my ability to use gravity to my own advantage, because I can store more elastic energy and I can use more elastic energy to be more explosive. So ultimately, I can improve performance in sport by making athletes more explosive and more resistant, more resilient to injuries as well. So I think there's a lot that comes with eccentric training, but it needs to be well done. And unfortunately, it needs to be very, very heavy.
Well, and also there has to be a whole preparatory phase where, somebody develops not only like the base level of GPP to be able to survive it, but also develops a lot of the tensile strength associated with it. Like you take somebody that's not in physically good shape and not used to handling heavy loads, and then all of a sudden you load them up with 120% of their 1RM and ask them to do a 3 to 4 second eccentric, and all of a sudden you're going to see like fucking things exploding everywhere. And I know that when we did big heavy eccentric blocks, it was always after like a huge preparatory phase. And I think where a lot of people fuck this stuff up is they kind of like choose their own adventure and go to the very end, and they don't realize that you have to go through that. There's a whole prep part of this thing, like like we'll throw in when we do some of the like Cal Dietz's triphasic, we throw in GPP blocks just to make sure that people are keeping their base level conditioning high, so that they have the ability to recover, so that the quality of the movement is better. And I know when we did heavy eccentrics, and we used to do a lot of heavy eccentrics on like the bench press, we do with dumbbells and we do them with squats. It was always towards the end when everybody was in pretty good shape. It was too early. We just saw fucking people rupture pecs and tear shit and do some crazy things. So that was always interesting. The one I was going to ask you about is, what did the research conclude on power force development using blood flow restricted training?
So what we did, we actually did a modified Bosco test to look at the effect of acute blood flow restriction on power output. And as far as I can tell, when you look at very short bouts of high intensity power movements, such as like jumping or like anything that is explosive, within 30 to 45 seconds, whether you have blood flow restriction on or not, the effect is not that noticeable. So there is, which leads me to believe that there's a way to use BFR in just general power training, and it might lead to more benefit than not in terms of long-term adaptation. I don't know the answer for that yet because we haven't done longitudinal studies yet, but at least I can tell acutely using BFR doesn't compromise muscle function, because my concern was, if you look at like different methodologies for developing power, like you look at velocity-based training, weightlifting, plyometrics, whatever, you want to make sure that when athletes are training, they can keep an adequate level of, first, rate of force development, second, peak power output, and third, overall peak velocity. If any of those variables starts to drop or decline more than 10, 15%, you might be doing conditioning, but you're not making them more powerful or more explosive. They have to be fresh. They have to be able to explode when they perform lifts or sprints or whatever. And my concern was, okay, if I put on a cuff and I occlude blood flow to the muscles, like, am I going to impair muscle function to the point that training is not effective anymore? So I got to the point of proving that that's not the case if efforts are very short and short distance. Now, the next step would be to develop a protocol that uses BFR together with plyometrics or like lifting with velocity-based training or weightlifting movements, whatever the case may be, for 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, and see if there's an additional benefit in using BFR to improve whatever metrics we're looking at, like rate of force development, power output, because we all know that it works for hypertrophy, but hypertrophy doesn't mean strength. Like a bigger muscle can be a bigger muscle, but doesn't mean that it's going to be a stronger muscle. Like a bigger muscle just
theoretically of a larger cross-sectional size of a muscle should be able to support more weight.
Correct. Theoretically.
Theoretically, but that's not the case. We tested the BFR. So when we were back out in California, we're in Texas now. Dr. Sato, the inventor of Katsu, we got plugged in with him, and I went and interviewed him. And he sent me a bunch of programs, like, hey, these are the programs that they'd use with like the Japanese sprint team for their skaters and skiers. And he actually wrote me a bodybuilding program. And he had some crazy thing, wasn't he able to lock out like 1,200 pounds on a bench press? Well, I mean, the other impressive thing when I met him, I don't know if you ever met him, he's like 70 years old, and the dude's still in pretty phenomenal shape. So that alone is just like a good sign up for him. But he sent me this programming. And it looked like do your standard training, and then here's like kind of like the circuits that we want to kind of set up. And so we were doing these like 15, 20-minute circuits using the blood flow restriction. And we used it with thousands of athletes. And the one thing that was universally true is everybody put on muscle. Everybody said that they felt better. I didn't necessarily see the carryover in terms of like 1 RMs, 3 RMs, and any of the big basic movements. But people said that they felt better. They had less joint distress, and injuries that they had tended to heal. So I think that there was like a therapeutic effect by including the blood, and then all the other growth factors associated with it. But we didn't necessarily see like the world beating, like, hey, this guy put 5 to 10% on all of his lifts. We just didn't see that. But in terms of body composition, everybody looked better. But I also didn't know if the fact that we were doing conditioning circuits at the end, in an occluded state, was just giving people a gnarly pump, and that was resulting in them looking better. But I mean, we use it, and I think what's really cool is in terms of rehab, the fact that you can occlude muscles and have people that are can't load, or let's say they're going through joint replacements or tendon issues or whatnot, can still occlude and still get some solid work done without loading the shit out of the joint.
Absolutely, and you said a very, very true thing. Like they look better, they look buff, they look like lean and ripped, but muscle size doesn't always equal muscle function. So that hypertrophy can come from many different ways. It can be good hypertrophy, meaning that you have more contractile proteins in your muscle, but it can also be mostly sarcoplasmatic hypertrophy, where like your muscles are just swollen full of like glycogen and water. So the cross-sectional area is bigger, because if you were to cut them, you'll find a bigger muscle, you find bigger fibers, but that's not contractile elements that you can use to develop more strength, so you always have to be careful. The way hypertrophy is always like it's a delicate topic because it's very easy to see. Like if someone gets bigger, like you see that it's bigger, it's heavier on the scale, there's more mass. But is that good mass that they can use, or is just that weight that they can't use? It's always like it's very tricky to get people bigger and stronger and more powerful.
In Verkhoshansky's work and also in Zadaskorsky's work, they were real big into this kind of sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy. And it's this kind of like one was more of a functional muscle or usable muscle, and the other one was more of a show, kind of like you said, pumped up with glycogen and hydration and they really kind of talked about like different actual kind of training rep ranges and volume. One is more bodybuilding opposed from, let's say, like singles, doubles, triples, like an Olympic lifter. Is it? I mean, I like as I read it, it was very if this then that. But I've kind of seen a little bit of like almost cross section where I've seen bodybuilders and people that were strong lifted higher rep ranges that would be considered one, and then there was a whole bunch of stuff where people were coming out like, this doesn't exist anymore. There's no such thing. Nothing exists in a vacuum. And, if it happens, it's a crossover. So I was hoping for a little definitive stance on this.
So the way I look at it, and I try to use hypertrophy is a very controversial topic in general, period. Like no one has a definite
We're actually going to call this, we're just going to put hypertrophy on this podcast because instantly that'll result in like a
hypertrophy controversy.
Solved. Not to the very
solved.
Yeah.
Tune in next week.
I mean, we're going to fight over this topic.
It's insane when you bring up the word hypertrophy. Like when we were dealing with the CrossFit market, hypertrophy was like the dirtiest word you could throw out there. There'd be like sexual harassment, drugs, hypertrophy number one. So, but yet in the bodybuilding realm, hypertrophy is this, like the golden goose, it's the egg, it's, the brass ring that everybody's shooting for. So like, why is it so controversial? And more importantly, like, how does it happen? And how can people tap into this? Because at the end of the day, I think everybody wants to carry more muscle. I mean, if you look at the actuary charts, the person that is able to maintain their lean muscle mass the longest lives the longest. So we know there's a direct relationship between lean body mass and longevity and strength and being able to live your best life. But it seems pretty interesting, or at least from our point of view, it seems pretty interesting. But yeah, man, it's debated all day on the interwebs.
Let me try to give you my answer, and I hope it's clear enough. It's not necessarily what I 100% embrace and believe, but what science is showing us. There seems to be three factors that contribute to muscle growth and hypertrophy. Muscle damage, which means inflammation, mechanical tension or mechanotransduction, which is an independent contributor to muscle hypertrophy, and hypoxia or metabolic damage. And if you look at these three factors, so muscle damage is just how much tension the sarcomere creates from the inside out, and how much damage and disarray you can create in the sarcomere. So you increase muscle damage if you train at an optimal load that allows enough time under tension. And that optimal load is anywhere between 70 and 90% of 1 rep max. So somewhat heavier than what a normal bodybuilding routine would call for. On the other hand, though, if you look at just sheer tension and how much tension you impose over your sarcomeres, that has to do with the time under tension during the eccentric. So you want to stretch that time under tension when you're lowering the weight. And if you put the two things together, if you want to do enough time under tension for your muscles to grow, and you want to stretch the eccentric to the point that you can handle, you're probably not going to be able to work at 90% of your 1 rep max. You're going to be closer to like 70 to 80. And then you throw in hypoxia or metabolic damage. If you want to maximize hypoxia and metabolic damage, you have to shorten rest periods. And if you shorten the rest periods, you can lift very heavy. You probably have to lower the weight from set to set. So that brings down the spectrum of loading even further down towards 60. So if you're looking at the ideal combination for muscle hypertrophy to occur at its best, you're probably looking at 60 to 70% of 1 rep max, 4 to 8 repetitions, 40 to 60 seconds of time under tension per set, and anywhere between 30 and 60 seconds rest in between sets. And that's, in my opinion, at least, much closer to what a bodybuilder would do than a real athlete. Because if you look at real bodybuilders are athletes too, but like a more like competitive type of athlete.
I don't know, man. We went to Mr. Olympia and
oh my God.
The one thing that was universally true was everybody there looked really hungry that was competing. I remember I was standing next to Nick. He finished top 5. He was in the Olympia. I was standing next to him. First of all, he was about 5'4", and all I could think of is this dude looks really hungry and really thirsty. I don't know how athletic that is, but man, like those.
I would hate to sit next to that guy on a plane.
If you could if there was a category for athlete that involves suffering, I got to go with bodybuilding.
I agree.
And probably Navy SEALs.
I mean, I grew up watching Ronnie Coleman's YouTube, so like that was very motivational, but definitely not good reference points for athletics, at least.
Yeah, Ronnie was enormous. I mean, he's still the biggest dude I've ever seen. Yeah. So he had a deal years ago, probably this has got to be 10, 15 years ago, where you could actually book a deal where you went and stayed with him for the weekend and he cooked you pancakes at his house.
Where was Power Athlete Radio?
I am so depressed. I remember, God, I can't remember her name. Her name was Kimmy. She was married to Adrian Bosman when, of CrossFit fame. And so Kimmy came down and used to hang out with us. And she was like obsessed with Ronnie. And she was like, check this out. We could go have pancakes at his house. And I remember being like, we got to do this. And we never did it. We should have fucking gone. How about a great story that'd been like, I ever tell you about the time I had pancakes at Ronnie Coleman's house? Fuck. God damn it. Now I cook Ronnie Coleman pancakes at my house. All right. But if you think about bodybuilding, I mean, the one thing that bodybuilders have figured out is more importantly, like the sport of hypertrophy. I mean, there's probably no other set of athletes on the planet. And if you look at how they train, but what's wild is that there's no universal like agreement on training style. You have a guy like Dorian Yates, where it was, heavy, 1-2 sets to failure. I mean, he really understood mechanical tension and more importantly, mechanical failure better than anybody. Mike Metzer was in that category. We had Jake Cutler on the podcast who claimed that his entire training was 4 sets of 12 and he never really trained very heavy. And it was always, 60, 70%, real short rest periods, hammered through his workout. And he's like, I don't really have any injuries to this day because I don't think I ever handled the heavy poundages. His whole thing was like, could I consume enough calories to be in that good a shape? Which, you never hear Dorian Yates really talk about diet. Like, I mean, I've heard him talk about diet, but whenever you ask him, like Jay's major thing about his physique and what he was able to do had to do, I mean, if you hear him talk, he said, the training was important. It was the diet piece. It was the rest. It was the recovery. Dorian, on the other hand, is like, I would fight wars in the gym and, I ate food too, but. So it's really interesting where we get into this, where there really isn't anything universally agreed upon. And it's really finding what works for each individual, and then there's also like the drug question, which I still believe to this day that there's certain individuals that maybe just have more receptor sites that just react more favorably to the drugs than other people. And I remember Zhang is telling me that years ago that when Arnold and all those guys were trained down at Gold's Gym, like they all had access to the same drugs. Everybody took the exact same. Arnold just looked better than everybody else with the same amounts. So his thing was, or George's idea was that certain people just react differently and that there's different receptor sites and different metabolic pathways. And some people react really favorably to it. It's pretty interesting if you talk to those pro bodybuilders and whoever knows if they're being honest, but the top guys, when they start talking about their drug stuff, like isn't as gnarly as the dude at the local show. It's just the fact that they maybe have more genetic potential that's able to be maximized.
When you look at hypertrophy, like we just briefly touch upon the main elements in training, and we're just describing barely physiology. Then you have to consider genetics, like how individual responds to training, and epigenetic. What's their environment, how they grow up, like what kind of like nutritional like habits they have, and so far and so forth. There's so much that goes into it. It's like almost impossible to predict. Like if you do this, you're going to grow, you're going to compete at Mr. Olympia. Like even with everything else being the same training program, same diet, same drugs, the outcome is still far from being predictable. When it comes to hypertrophy, when it comes to strength training, is a bit more of a science, but hypertrophy is definitely not that black and white type of approach.
Tom Ankledon, who's a good friend of ours out in Arizona, PhD, he's been on the podcast a number of times, has said to me for years that he does a ton of blood work and especially 20, 30 years of micronutrient testing. And his contention is that the nutrient density of our present food source is so depleted. He goes, every year I test, people are more and more micronutrient deficient. He said 100 years ago, he goes, you could have eaten the same diet and the amount of nutrients in the food would have resulted in like superhumans compared to what we know now within training. And everybody looks back at like these old time strongmen. And he's like, his contention is that the nutrient density of the food was so much greater. We weren't battling BPAs and all these environmental toxins that he thinks are just fucking killing the immune system and really just, fucking up everybody's gut and ability to absorb nutrients. So, I mean, even in the last 30 years, he's like, I'm telling you, every year when I look at blood work and we start looking at nutrient density and more importantly, the nutrient deficiencies in the people, he goes, it just keeps improving, climbing every year.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Just to wrap up and closing on the hypertrophy war and debate, when we describe, and that's something that comes out in the Soviet manuals a lot, so I found it interesting. I found it very interesting too, is that when you look at the way we understand training for hypertrophy, works great, and it can actually make you stronger because you're developing more muscle mass, and if you train correctly, you're also going to get stronger. However, they have this, I don't know, I honestly don't even know how to translate that in English correctly, but they have this like undergoing jokes in different books and articles and studies published in the Soviet Union and Northern Europe, like Finland, all those countries. And like even Akin and Comey used it, like researchers that we're all familiar with nowadays. I guess the best way to express that is called the theory of the two sprinters, which I know it doesn't sound a lot, but the way they explain it, and I witnessed it myself on a presentation with Dr. Akinen, like back maybe 15 years ago. Let's assume that like your performance is pushing a very heavy box, like a very heavy box, 100 kilos, 200 kilograms or whatever. And you have two sprinters attached to it. One pulls in one direction, one pulls in the other direction. One sprinter is your type 1 muscle fiber. One sprinter is your type 2 muscle fiber. When you do, you know that if you want to move that box faster, you would have your type 2 muscle fibers to overpower type 1 muscle fiber. So the whole block can move faster towards one direction. But if you do too much hypertrophy work, and especially what they're very picky with is not the type of work that you do, is the volume of work that you do. When you do very high volume training, which bodybuilders tend to do, the fatigue that you build up during training and the amount of like metabolic stress that you build up during training, even if you train heavy and you train more like a power lifter than a bodybuilder, your type 1 muscle fiber will grow as well. And if the sprinter gets heavier, just as heavy as the type 2 muscle fibers are, the net force and velocity you can generate, the amount of inertia that you have to overcome is much bigger, because now the sprinter pulls lower, but it's bigger and heavier. So the net resultant is different. And that's why they always say, like, when you look at hypertrophy, you have to think that it's not just your type 2 muscle fibers that are growing, it's your type 1 muscle fibers that are growing as well. And the more you grow them, the more inertia your muscle will have to overcome to move faster. And if it can move as fast, the overall rate of force development will be compromised and your performance on the field of play will change, because we know, and I think that's pretty much agreed upon by anyone, like strength is extremely important for sport, and it makes a difference between low-level athletes and elite-level athletes, but stronger athletes are not necessarily better athletes. For you to be a better athlete, you have to be stronger, but also more powerful, more explosive, have greater rate of force development, greater speed, and so on and so forth. So always be, my take-home message is like, always be very careful programming too much hypertrophy work in athletics, because it can become counterproductive.
The one thing that we observed too, and this was something that kind of, I guess, was real eye-opening for me, especially in a sport like playing football, where it's, 3 to 5 seconds, 100% max intensity, followed by anywhere from 45 to 90 seconds of rest, and then you're doing this in sets, and so it's based upon this like max effort than rest. What we found was that too much circuit training or too much volume, like, hey, I'm going to train for 15-minute, 20-minute circuits. And I remember this very clearly in Supra training. They talk about a conversion of fast twitch fibers to slow twitch fibers to be able to handle more sustained submaximal loads.
Cyclical as well. They dropped, like, athletes avoiding cyclical monotonous exercises for that also the transition for muscle fibers.
Yeah. So they were really always talking about like, you have to, train in such a way that safeguards those type 1, those fast twitch muscle fibers, if that's what you're going to need to be successful in your sport. And don't get sucked into this, like, 30 minutes of circuit training, because now you get this kind of conversion from slow twitch to from fast twitch to slow twitch. And that was very, very apparent because I remember us doing metabolic conditioning cycles and just doing a bunch of conditioning stuff. And at the end of the day, that would almost have to taper off for more max effort speed and then finding other ways to hit our conditioning.
Yeah, it always comes down to metabolic stress, like your muscle fibers. Whatever muscle fiber you look at, whether that is type 1 or type 2, you're born with that fiber connected with one neuron, and that neuron is not going to change unless you artificially change innervation in your muscle. So the speed at which your muscle can twitch and contract depends on the motor neuron. What changes is the metabolic profile of those fibers. And if you keep training for some type of endurance, which means that the volume is bigger, you're going to have that transition from type 2 to type 1, which is inevitable by increasing volume, and that can compromise performance. I agree.
What do we want to get into next?
Man, I'd love to get into like rate of force development and ways that you're finding. I mean, because we've done hypertrophy. So the next thing is rate of force development, which to me is really the hallmark for power and, more importantly, athletic performance. If you can take an athlete, like you said, like the analogy, like I thought the analogy of the box and then, the two sprinters trying to pull away was amazing. I always think about it like almost like bullets, right? You have like a sleeker bullet that can travel faster with less powder coming out of a gun. And when you start getting into these bigger bullets, yeah, they have more energy, but not over a longer distance. But then you have to pack more powder in them to get them to move the same muscle velocity to be able to gain, because it'll have to overcome, gravity and inertia and other factors. So I always think about or I'd like to get into a little bit of the research you've been doing on rate of force development and, more importantly, techniques for developing it.
Absolutely. I think, and I was talking about this with Dr. Comfort at the NSCA conference. When you look at, so there are three topics that somehow always connected. It's always like strength, rate of force development, and power. And you're looking at just different combination of these three things. The underlying philosophy is always there that if you look at, or if you wanted to look at muscle mechanics and you look at like Hill's model, the more force you ask your muscle to generate, the slower the velocity will be, and vice versa. And that has brought over the years a large number of practitioners to misunderstanding this original research, to always trade off find the perfect combination between load and velocity to generate power. Like they either go very, very light weight and they move it very, very fast, or they go a bit heavier and they move it very, very slow. However, if you look at the research, especially if you look at the original research from Archibald Vivian Hill back in like 1923 to 1932, what he's describing is the force and the velocity at which your sarcomere shortens. So your sarcomere will shorten faster if you put less load on it, and vice versa. But when you look at the velocity of movement, which is where rate of force development really matters, in biomechanics, force equals mass time acceleration. So if you want to have more acceleration, which means more top velocity, you need to apply more force. If you don't apply more force, all the power that you generate is going nowhere. So when you train for rate of force development and you train for power development, you always have to look at that compromise between force and velocity, but you always have to keep in mind that you need to hit at least a minimum amount of weight for you to apply the necessary force to be more explosive. And that's where velocity-based training really comes into play. Like instead of looking at or guessing what velocity you're moving at, you're going to pick a load that is going to be the heaviest possible for you to train at a certain velocity. And you're just going to you're going to keep moving that weight until you move it faster. And when you move it faster, the weight is going to get heavier. So ultimately, when you want to develop power, even when you want to develop or maximize rate of force development, you still can't give up on loading. The amount of overload you place on the system is still absolutely important. If you look at the way, and I'm big time not an expert on velocity-based training. There are many, many people that are more skilled than me in velocity-based training. But I've learned in my way from Dr. Carmelo Bosco's original work. is the one that actually kind of like pioneered the load velocity continuum for velocity-based training. Like the way he applied it, he never played around with like different velocity and different loads. He picked either a very heavy load and he kept it there until the athlete was moving it faster, or when the speed got to a certain level, which was usually 1.2, 1.3 meter per second, it just increased the load and increased the load and increased the load. So that load and velocity were going up at the same time. It didn't change like 30% of water max for a block and then 70% of water max for another block. It was always the heaviest way possible that could be moved at a certain velocity. That velocity was usually starting at 0.5, 0.6 meter per second, all the way up to 1.2 meters per second. And that's the way he developed some of the best, for instance, like shot putters or discus throwers in Europe back in the 80s and 90s. So I think when we look at rate of force development or developing power in general, it's not just about like strength is important because it's the foundation of everything you do when it comes to like explosive movement. It's true, it is the foundation, but you need to carry on that loading component in your training day in and day out consistently. When you start going too light, and I see a lot of practitioners doing that because in the name of velocity-based training, if you want to move a weight at 1.2 meters per second, they have to go all the way back down to like 30, 40% of water max. There might be a time and place for that too, I'm sure. But when you look at improving just propulsion in general and the amount of force an athlete can generate in the shortest amount of time possible to move faster in space, that load needs to be present because again, force equals mass time acceleration. So if you want to move faster, you need to move more weight and you need to move it faster.
Well, I mean, where does strength play into this? I mean, two things. What we found was intent is something that's not discussed enough. Like actually teaching an athlete the intent of moving fast and how to move fast. Like that was the whole. Whenever I read anything about rate of force development, like I always thought that there should be like a block of training where you start lighter and then you progress and actually focus on the individual's intent to move fast. It's something I'm dealing with my daughter. My daughter's 10 and she's a swimmer. And like this idea of intent is like completely escapes her. And she's like, so wait a minute, like diving off the blocks, if I want to move, if I want to push harder and go faster, I can. I'm like 100%. If your intent is to move as fast as possible, you have to understand and like that connection between intent and your body is like this really interesting piece. And so we're going through all these different practices on trying to like gain intent. And I just keep striking out. And so yesterday she's like, well, what about like if is there like she goes, hey, is there something in the weight room I can do to deal with this intent? And I had this kind of epiphany moment that I wonder if there's a relationship between intent and strength. Like as you get stronger and you're in, is intent something that's taught? And more importantly, like how do we teach that? Because I'm selfishly, but then also with rate of force development, like once the athlete understands the intent, isn't the idea that you have to continually progress the implements or the weights or the percentages as they grow in terms of strength, because you're not necessarily training these in a vacuum. They have to be in a concurrent training model. So I assume the athlete's getting stronger, also doing rate of force power development, and there's kind of a symbiotic deal between one and the other.
Well, you opened the door for a conversation that can take me for hours now.
Well, that's good. I like rabbit holes. Let's go. But I mean, I mean, this is stuff. What's so cool about Power Athlete and what we do is we write programs for thousands of athletes, and the way it's set up through Train Heroic, I can collect data on all of these athletes, and they follow a very, like if I explained to you the template, you'd be like, oh, that's. Like it's very easy for me to explain the template and really the hierarchy of programs, and the archetype for each program follows certain different training models. But so that's what we do. But I'm fucking don't want to talk, so you go.
I beg you, please stop me if I go too long, because I can literally go for hours here. But if I give my perspective on things, the way I approach this topic, I'm sure it's different for everyone. But the way I was brought up looking at strength training was all a question of like, move more weight, move heavier things. Who cares if you move them slow? Just lift the bar up and be done with that. However, starting in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, something slightly different, something happened in the world of powerlifting, and that changed and that carry over to athletics as well. Fred Hatfield made a big effort to make people aware of compensatory acceleration training, or CAT, which is you can train. That's what people tend to misunderstand. You still can train very heavy, and you still can train as a power lifter. You can still eat 80, 85, 90% of your 1 rep max. The body's probably going to move slow. So your external velocity is not going to look that fast. The movement is going to be slow and grindy. But if you put the intent of moving that bar at the highest velocity you can possibly generate on the way up, your adaptation is going to get better, which means that over time, you're going to get much stronger than what you would otherwise be if you just applied that crazy amount of force at the bottom of the movement and then you just free ride all the way to the top. And that's just basic biomechanics. And from biomechanics, you can prove that just by putting an EMG on the quadricep muscle or the glute muscle in a squat, you realize that they turn on a lot at the bottom of the squat, and then they slowly turn off as the movement progresses because mechanical advantage improves. So there are studies out there. I'm thinking about like Jones 1999 or other studies in the early 2000s, where they took two groups of American football players, so well-trained individuals, and they trained them. That was just for upper body strength. So same volume, same intensity, same frequency, same identical training load. The only difference was one group was not asked to move at a certain velocity. They just let them lift. The other group was coached in a way that they tried to get them to move the bar as fast as possible, as they possibly could on the way up. So the concentric portion of the movement. And again, you're not measuring the velocity. You don't care how fast that bar is moving. What you care about is the intent of moving that bar fast. And what they found after, I think it was like either 6 or 8 weeks of training, is that both groups, they equally got stronger. So their 1 rep max improved pretty much by the same amount. However, when they test them in a bench throw, so more ballistic movements, the group that trained with no compensatory acceleration training only slightly changed their performance in the bench throw. The other group improved by more than 30% in the bench throw. And when they even broke it down between eccentric, coupling time, and concentric, their coupling time between eccentric and concentric decreased by a lot, which means that overall the rate of force development improved just by trying to move those weight faster. And there's another bunch of research done on a very cool topic, which unfortunately is not very popular in strength and conditioning, but it is in rehab, which is known as maximum intended concentric velocity. So there are different protocols that you can apply, even in addition, where like by simply using intended high velocity, your level of adaptation will cover the entire spectrum from strength to power and rate of force development. And again, I want to repeat that one more time. The velocity at which you move the bar doesn't matter. If you're lifting 85% of your 1 rep max, if you're lifting 90% of your 1 rep max, inevitably your bar will move slow. But if you try to move the bar as fast as you possibly can through the entire range of motion, somehow you're still going to get more benefit out of it. If you want to even like bring it to the next level, you can throw in like an accelerometer and use velocity-based training, or you can put in bands and chains, which is known as accommodative resistance training, and that forces you even more to apply that constant velocity or increasing velocity on the way up and maximize adaptation. And if you look at the majority of meta-analysis published over the last 5 to 6 years, and I'm a big fan of chains and bands because I grew up with Louis Simmons. I used to love Louis Simmons at West Barbell. So I've done a lot of band work and chain work. But then if you were to compare results with like accommodative resistance training and traditional powerlifting training, when you look at sheer strength, there's no difference. You get stronger as long as you move big weights. But when you look at power, training with chains and bands does improve your power rate of development. So it is more athletic than traditional powerlifting type training. And that to close the circle now, everything goes back to wanting to move that bar or being forced to move that bar as fast as you possibly can on the way up. Because athletes cannot be able to perceive whether or not they're moving fast. But the moment you put an elastic band on the bar, and if they don't move faster, the band is going to push them down. They need to learn how to move faster. And if on top of that, you provide that augmented feedback with velocity-based training just by putting an iPad in front of them and having them see what velocity they're moving at, well, you're combining motor learning and you're combining physical development in just one. It's the perfect combination, I think.
Feedback goes a long way. I was thinking for Jamie, what about weighted box jumps?
Dude, I think the problem is she's just super skinny and she needs body awareness. So that intermuscular coordination issue, like I think she doesn't know how to, she's so young, she hasn't wired up yet. So I think like even though she might intend to move fast, she doesn't know how to make her body move fast. And the one thing that we found in just beginners with just basic barbell movements is that intermuscular coordination and just almost that like what's the word, like arranging of the body. And where now all of a sudden, like as strength improves, like that coordination effect, becomes so important for her in terms of like, okay, now I'm in this position, because if you look at the hip angle, they're in kind of a staggered stance. The hip angle, they're bent at the waist. I mean, if she's standing up, it's, maybe 75 degrees, and then they bend over, and then they have to almost flare and push off. Like I'm looking at it like, what if she just gets stronger with just a basic barbell movement, and then just teach her a little bit of plyometrics? I mean, it should go a long way. I mean, I think where people fuck up, we get emails about this all the time, especially with kids. Like the minimal dose for kids is like the maximal effect. Like if you could just get them to like do basic movements under load 1 or 2 days a week, whereas, like I saw a question the other day, some 20-year-old kid who's never lifted weights jumps into something like Jack Street. He's like, I feel like this is a little advanced. 100%. Like the reason that you're a beginner is because the simplistic principles and the basics are still very, very powerful. You'll get a laugh out of this. The old power lifter that trained me when I started, when I was about 14 years old, was buddies with Fred Hatfield. And he used to talk about compensatory acceleration and the idea that we want to try to break the weights and his mechanical advantage improves, so does speed. So like when we would bench, bringing the weight up and then trying to literally break the bar in half, or trying to punch your hands through, 2 inches, so that when you go to punch somebody in football, you're not punching to their chest, you're actually trying to punch through them. Or the idea of, coming out of the bottom and trying to vertical jump the weight out of, through the roof. And so he used to always talk about, like don't lift weights like old people, have sex, slow and careful, be violent, try to break those motherfuckers. And if you can break them, we'll go get new ones. And I think that training style, when I was young, I've since slowed down a little bit, but when I was young, when I started lifting weights or when I went to go train, people would be like, dude, you're going to hurt yourself. And I remember thinking like, don't be slow and careful, be violent. And I think that ended up translating into, 10 years in the NFL. But it was interesting when I got onto this coaching side, we were running a bunch of training programs, and we went into this really interesting testing model. And I got all these results back, and they were super confusing. Like I couldn't see any like common threads in them. And so I started watching the videos, and the thing that was universally true was that everybody was really slow and careful. And I ended up reaching out to Fred Hatfield, and we had a series of podcasts with him, especially the idea of like, how he was able to generate force and that idea of intent, and then basically started programming that into all of our programs and talking about mechanical advantage increases, so does speed, and compensatory acceleration, even figuring out like different percentages to try to teach people intent, more importantly, compensatory acceleration training. And I think that's been one of those things that is still so groundbreaking today, but yet people forget about it. And when I talk about it, like what are you talking about? What's this cat stuff? And, the guys over at, Gas Station Ready, like Josh Bryant, who we met, who was taught with Fred Hatfield, he still really beats the war drum. Yeah, he still beats the war drum. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's something that nobody is really talking about, that idea of intent and trying to break those motherfucking weights.
I think it's almost universally true that if you learn how to train faster, you're eventually going to get stronger no matter what. When you're working with more like older athletes, I would just be a little bit more forgiving in kids or younger athletes, just because speed to some extent has a lot to do with proprioception. So how well you can feel your body moving in space. And when you're going through early puberty and your body's growing so much and your levers are changing so much, and one day your leg is like this short and the following day you're super, super tall because you're growing, that proprioception like is skewed and maybe they want to move faster. They're not well in tune with their bodies yet.
Well,
but then after they reach,
like, does it matter? I mean, like, as long as the intent is there, does it really matter
correct.
how fast they're moving? As long as they're intending to move fast.
Yeah, communicate the intent. Then whether or not they're able to move faster or be super coordinated when they do it, just give them a little bit of like grace and freedom because they're still growing. But sure. Communicating the intent of moving faster, 1000%.
What I can't remember if it was the Russian training manuals or Verkhoshansky's work, but there was some pretty detailed writing that I ended up calling it the priming the pump, where they had kids, like huge cross sections of kids that they were putting in different athletic strength training programs pre-puberty. Other kids they didn't. And then once they hit puberty, they were putting them into like a general training program. And they noticed that the kids that had done strength training or something that was more physically demanding before puberty gained strength and muscle at a much greater rate than the kids that didn't. And I can't remember if it was Verkhoshansky or it might even have been Dr. Romanoff might have talked about it as well in one of his talks. That idea of priming the pump, and that's kind of why, like for my kids, like my daughter swims, which I love, just because the amount of like metabolic distress and conditioning that they do in the water is so high that like the metabolic pathways, I mean, you could never equate that out of the water. And so I remember years ago, Dave Spitz and I noticed that girls that had swam at a high level early on tended to gain muscle at a much greater rate later on. And I mean, we've seen like Colleen Fausch and some of these other girls that were high level swimmers once they travel over, start lifting weights. China Cho, another one, but end up putting on a ton of muscle. So that was why. And then, just the fact that I love the fact that she can get out there and I mean, she can do it every day, and they fucking go hard on those kids, like intervals, and they swim a ton. So, but have you seen anything like that or any research associated with that priming of the pump?
Yeah, a lot of it came from Carmelo Bosco in Italy too. He did a lot of work with the national track and field team, developing athletes all the way from the age of 6 to the age of like 21, 22. And I remember him always debating whether or not this priming effect was physiological, like your muscles are just more responsive to training after you hit puberty, or simply by teaching them good lifting mechanics and good training etiquettes and teaching them how to be intense when they train, if that just exponentially increased the response after they hit puberty. Like, it was always questioning whether or not it was a physiological thing or just like a motor learning type of situation where like you just prepare that as soon as they hit puberty, they can already train at that level of intensity that they need to grow. So they're going to grow faster and get stronger. In my opinion, probably is a combination of both. But yes, it's fascinating. Youth training is a very fascinating topic.
Yeah, no, it's the one thing which has been really cool about, all these advances in technology, especially like YouTube and whatnot. You'll see like clips of these kids, like little kids, like 7, 8, 9 years old playing football. And there's one kid who's just like remarkably different than all the others. And, and they're, they'll interview the dad, and like, the dad played professional sports or maybe played at a high level, and the kid's just super focused. I always love whenever kind of forget about it. And then I'm watching the playoff game with Joe Burrow, and they were showing a bunch of his high school and junior high and like, when he started playing football and his clips and how good he was. And they were like, even when this kid stepped out, even at this young age, we knew that he was going to be special.
I don't know his story, but I'm in.
Well, he's
awesome.
Young kid in Ohio. They went and interviewed his high school coach, who was like, his football knowledge to the point where they were drawing up plays in the dirt during a game. And he's like, Coach, I think this will win. And he's like, it was like having an offensive coordinator who's like 16, 17 years old on the field who understood it. And even they talked, what was the coach at Louisiana?
Coach O?
Yeah, Coach O said that when he showed up, he's like, he just wanted to talk about football and go eat some crawfish. That was it. He just wanted to wrap football and eat some food. Like, didn't want to go out and drink or party or anything. Just let's talk about football and let's go eat some crawfish.
He's a big cigar guy.
You know what? I'm a fan. But I think what's cool today is that now we get to see this stuff and we get to almost tag these kids and then get an opportunity to see how they progress. But I definitely I almost wonder, like, what's the balance on that? Like, you have kids that I played with who were high-level performers that end up burning out when they're 14, 15 and never want to play sports again. And then you have other kids who are just taken to it. Or like for me, I was kind of a late bloomer. Like, I didn't start playing football till I got to high school. And then, I grew from 6 foot to 6'4" in high school and grew another 2 inches in college. So when I left college, I was 6'6". So, there was that kind of late bloomer, like J.J. Watt late bloomer effect, whereas some people have success early. I think you see both sides of this. And the one thing that's universally true, what he said is nobody fucking knows. You can give somebody who have the greatest genetics, greatest training, all the opportunity in the world. And if they don't have that little thing inside them to be great, it's impossible to teach it in the weight room and anywhere else.
I think you said a very important thing, like the little thing inside them. Ultimately, I think it's a question of, you can look at all the physiology of it. You can look at all the studies, blood works, whatever you want. But I think what really makes a difference for a youth athlete to either stick with sport, grow and get better, or quit is whether or not they're intrinsically motivated to play sport and they just enjoy what they do and they want to do it better, or they're forced by their parents to perform in sport and compete in sports, which is extrinsic motivation. They just want to please them. If they enjoy what they do, chances are they're going to stick around for a long time, and they're going to get much better at their sport or their sports if they want to play more than one. If they have to do that, but they don't find pleasure in doing that, I think their career starts off in the worst possible condition already. Like, I think it's better for them to do less in terms of overall volume, do more in terms of type of activities, but do everything because they enjoy doing it. If they have to be forced, I think the whole purpose of like embracing a career in sport like loses its meaning,
Mm-hmm. Did you find that balance of kids that parents wanted them to be there and kids that wanted to be there in racing growing up?
A lot of them. I remember my dad used to stay in the paddock just looking people getting ready for a race, and he always used to tell me, you'll notice the kids that are gonna win or they're gonna do well, because while the other kids are getting all geared up, putting their gears on, taking their time, look all pretty, talk to their parents, the other kids already have their helmet on and in the racing car ready to go. Like, they're there because they want to be there. They enjoy what they do. And they might start at the back of the grid. If they love what they're doing, they're going to find a way to win. And I found that in sports too. Like, sometimes you find, and I was blessed to work with a lot of like youth athletes in the last 5-6 years. You'll find that there are kids out there which might not have the financial resources that other kids have. They might not have enough money to pay for private coaching. They might not have enough money to even join a gym, but they have motivation enough to push them through and become great athletes. Like, I think it's all a question of being motivated.
So how do we train that?
How do we change that or train that?
No, how do we train it? I mean, it's the one thing I noticed is that certain people don't like to lose. I know for me, I don't like to lose. And whereas, like, for me, that was important because it drove me to train. It kind of pushed me in terms of this like intrinsic motivation of like, somebody was out there working harder than me. I'm going to go out and because I don't want to lose. Whereas for me as a boy, that was different. Whereas I have twins, and my girls are more based on like finding something that they enjoy and something they're good at. So that's like important. Like, they want to feel like they're good at something. And I try to explain to them that nobody's good at anything. Like, time and pressure. I mean, I try to give them the Shawshank Redemption analogies of like, geology is just a study of time and pressure. I mean, that's performance, time and pressure, right? Like, how much opportunity do you have? How long have you been doing it? How long have you been focused on it? Whereas they think like there should just be sports that I'm just naturally good at and I should gravitate towards those. And I remember being like, you should try to find those. And that's been like an interesting piece in, because I grew up with all brothers and all cousins, and we didn't really know any girls when we were growing up. So it's pretty interesting having daughters, like the difference in mindset. Whereas I think a lot of boys want to succeed in spite, whereas girls are more like motivationally based. Like, they want to be successful to please a coach or to do something. Whereas I was more about just trying to prove the motherfucker wrong. So there's a huge difference in female male athletes. In terms of that piece, like on the physiology side, a lot of this training stuff, when we look at a lot of the studies, and whether it be compensatory acceleration or power, rate of force, all that is done on male subjects. What about some female specific things and some things that, with female only studies that we've seen? And, because we can't train women the same way we train men in terms of like, we know that women can handle a higher percentage of 1 RM for more reps. And there's some different things that we have to take into account. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The majority of studies that we always base our assumptions on have been done on predominantly male subjects. And when we're lucky, high level athletes, when we're not, just recreational athletes or active people. But we need to keep in consideration that there is a set of physiological differences between men and women, which, if you look at the sheer numbers, if you look at just how strong can a man become and how strong can a woman become, that difference is not that big as we expect it to be, because once you start taking consideration not just body weight but lean body mass, pound per pound, women are almost just as strong as men are, and that difference is there, which means that the tissues adapt just as well as men, if not better. The difference is just female have far less testosterone than male to begin with, like a tenth of it. So their adaptation is somewhat going to suffer from it. What we can do, knowing that, at least that's my approach, knowing that to begin with, testosterone is absolutely important in any type of activity that involves either strength or power. It's important because it makes your CNS work better and faster, and is as a permissive role toward hypertrophy. So if you have more testosterone in your bloodstream, you have more of an anabolic environment overall. So you're going to grow more in response to training. And if you grow more, your muscles are going to be larger. If you train well, your muscles are also going to be stronger. So women have less of that. And we know that by default because of physiology. And we know that training on and off itself, especially resistant training, will change acutely and chronically the way your body handles hormones. In particular, the more volume you do, the more frequency you have in training, the more your cortisol will spike. And if cortisol spike, testosterone and cortisol are no more in that ideal ratio for you to be able to recover from training. You're going to be, your recovery will be compromised. So if you already know that women start with lower testosterone, but their response in terms of cortisol is very similar to men, definitely you want to find a way to adjust volume and frequency to make sure that you're not hindering their ability to recover and adapt. I think that, again, that's my personal opinion. It's not backed up by science, at least that I know of. But I've worked quite a bit with female in rugby too, which is a predominantly strength-based type of sport. And I found the best results just by maybe increasing the volume, like you said, or the intensity within the sessions if they can handle it. But overall, doing less sessions and less volume compared to men. The intensity is the same, the exercise selection very similar. The way they train doesn't really change much, just giving them more time to rest and recover so that their hormones can be leveled in a way that is more conducive to like positive adaptation rather than overtraining. I think it's another thing that I've experienced, which is like one of those soft skills in training that is not quite tangible, but it's there. Like if you can communicate well when you're working with female athletes, they will give you 1000% of their effort, as much as they possibly can. Whereas men tend to get distracted, and I'm guilty of that just as much, tend to be like sidetracked by other goals, whereas female can be more like focused and oriented and like goal oriented. So their intensity can be quite higher than men of the same age and similar background. So overall, knowing that intensity is going to be higher, and they, to begin with, they start with less testosterone, just keep all training variables pretty much the same, just decrease volume per session and volume per microcycle, which pretty much comes down to training frequency.
I remember years ago when we were out at Westside, I remember talking to Louis Simmons about Prilipin's table, and like the rep range, and it was over 90%, somewhere between 4 and 10 reps. They talked about over like a training session, and I asked him like, hey, like because when I was training with him, he had me doing like 7, 8, 9, 10 reps, and some of his other guys were only doing 4 reps. And I asked him, I was like, what dictates that? And he was like, testosterone levels. The higher your test levels, the less reps we need, because it makes the central nervous system more efficient. So in reality, when everything's so efficient, the body works much better in terms of like neuromuscular coordination, testosterone's high level CNS. We can get more out of less. So they'll do the same amount of work, and like the training effect only needs 4 reps, where if your testosterone level isn't that high, artificially, you probably need double the volume, 8, 9, 10 reps. And so that was something that, Louis said, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting point, wrote it down. And it was actually years later that I actually read any research to support it. And when I asked Louis about it later on, he's like, no, it was something we observed. I never read any research on it. I just knew that those guys were more efficient. And like, that's what was interesting with a guy like Louis Simmons, who was in his training system, seeing these variables happening in real time. And only, years later did the research come out to support it, which is also goes back to Charles Poliquin's statement that if you got to wait for the research, you're going to be 10 years behind the game. So I'm wondering if that's the case, what's on the cutting edge right now for research that might be proved 10 years from now that, might be making the difference between, because if you think about it, we just keep working with the same variables. We have power, strength, speed, rate of force development, hypertrophy. I mean, the same things are kind of looked over again. I'm wondering, like, what's the next leap? What's the next evolution in terms of strength conditioning?
I think, just to back up what you just said, the way technology in sports is really making a difference now on the field and in research is that nowadays we have tools that we didn't used to have 10, 15, 20 years ago that allows us to maximize efficiency in training, which is what you were just referring to. Like back then, maybe Louis Simmons was just eyeballing and noticing that like someone with like more testosterone was able to express more intensity, so they needed less training volume. Nowadays, we can measure that. We can measure that just by putting an accelerometer on the bar and see how fast they're moving. And I think all this technology and all this evidence supporting that training smart is much more effective than training hard in the meaning like training with more volume and more frequency and overall more like time spent in the weight room. We can get just as strong doing less volume, doing that right, with the right intensity at the right velocity to create optimal adaptation, which is a game changer for many reasons. But in my opinion, the number one reason is where we train, and I'm putting myself now under the perspective of a strength and conditioning coach. We work in the weight room or on the field doing conditioning or whatever, to prepare our athletes to play their sport at a higher level. If we can get to that result, putting in less amount of work in the weight room, get the same outcome and allowing them more time and energy to spend practicing their sports, they're going to get better athletes because you become better at your sport by practicing your sport. If I can make you stronger and more explosive with the least amount of time possible, least disband of energy possible, and then you can go about and just go about your day and play your sport and recover and rest well and perform better, I think you hit the jackpot as a strength and conditioning coach. And nowadays we can do that. Like think about the way we handle velocity-based training. Let's make just a simple example. Let's say that like for a certain day on your piece of paper, when you developed your program, you have 6 sets of 3 repetitions of snatching a 75% 1 rep max for that day. Well, you know that you want to develop, probably want to develop power. That's why you chose that loading. And you create some sort of combination between sets and reps that seems to be reasonable. It's based on like what you read in a book or a journal or a magazine or whatever. But you have no way to prove if they need all those 6 sets. Maybe they only need 1, maybe they need 3. But because the evidence shows that if their performance, their velocity, their peak velocity on the bar decreases too much from set to set, their training effect is going to be compromised. So you put an accelerometer on the bar, you look at the first set, you do some benchmarking, you see what velocity you're hitting rep after rep. And if you start seeing that velocity declining more than 10, 15% by set number 4, well, then you call it a day. You stop your training right there. You move on and you do something else. So you have more attention to details. You know what type of action reaction you're triggering. You know how to monitor and map over time external load, but also internal load. And the same is true for like different type of training. Like think about heart rate variability. Now, if you do too much volume and you see that recovery being compromised, well, you know that it's probably best for you to take a day off if you're in the red. Or like if you're green and you're ready to go, you can do 2 sessions back to back.
Man,
so we have a way.
I think that HRV shit gets so dangerous.
It is.
And I'll tell you why, because like if you only train on the days that you feel good in the green, I start thinking like, what happens? You get up on game day and you're like, oh, it's not in the green. I'm in my red. So like, I think there's value to it. I just,
for guys like us.
Yeah, like I see people use HRV constantly on the programs and like, hey, you know, my thing was in the red, I didn't sleep. And it's not that they're making excuses, because I'm not saying that they are. What I'm saying is that they're using it to be like, hey, you know what, today might not be the best day. But I've had training sessions that I knew going into it I wasn't feeling my best that ended up being some of my best training sessions. And so I think that there's a really interesting balance. And I wonder as we get into this, like it can't always be like, you know, and that's what I fucking hated about Whoop. I hated the Whoop for their readiness scores and all that other shit. Cause I looked at this thing and was like, man, if I trained when this thing told me to, I would fucking never train. And so, you know, I mean, at the time I remember I was wearing it. I had two young twins. We weren't sleeping a ton, you know, business travel. I mean, there were so many factors that were contributing just to shitty HRV. And then I got to the point where I figured out, I'm like, I wonder if there's a hack on this. And so it was like, I think it was, I was taking like natural calm before bed. I would go on a 20-minute walk and I started doing some like meditation. And regardless of what happened during my day, if I went on a little short walk, did a little meditation and took some natural calm before bed, I could end up in the green. Yeah. And so I started finding ways to hack it. And I was like, man, if I can like use external forces to hack this thing, how important is it? And I realized that the technology when it came out was still pretty young and how they were doing it. And I just wonder if it'll ever get to the point where it's like, you know, you might not be fully recovered, but you need to get out there and fucking do your job. Yeah. So how do we balance that?
I mean, technology serves a purpose. Like it gives you an extra tool in your toolbox to be able to interpret results, but it cannot be the only thing you look at. And to like echo what you just said, like I used Whoop for, I think, close to 2 years without ever stopping, like just collecting data after data after data. And I did that.
We were 1 year exactly. Never missed.
Yeah. Good. And I mean, I liked it. There's good to it. But like when I did it, that was like at the beginning or shortly before the pandemic. So late 2019, early 2020. When the pandemic started, I took on more like aerobic training. So I started running, biking, do more stuff that I wasn't used to do before. And I also did, because I like to experiment with myself too. So I also did that with still weightlifting, doing intermittent fasting, and being on ketosis for 28 days a month. So I really put myself through hell because I didn't have anything else to do. So why not?
Yeah, let's set ourselves on fire and torture ourselves at the same time.
Yes, correct. And I realized I got to the point where like, just by fine tuning my program, I was able to be more days in the green than days in the like yellow or red. However, I got to the point where like I used to be green at the end of a week of training. So like Friday, but the Whoop didn't take into consideration that I was like 5 days depleted of glycogen. And when I tried to go out for a run in my green, I couldn't even keep 50% of my intensity because the Whoop doesn't, and RA variability doesn't keep everything into consideration. There's much more that goes into it. Like you said, external forces that you can act the system with. So yes, it gives you a tool. It lets you know that like probably you're doing something right about your training because somehow your sympathetic nervous system is recovering well, but it cannot be the only metric you use to take decisions about your training. You have to keep everything into consideration.
I always tell people if they really want to kill their testosterone levels and fuck up their androgen profile, intermittent fast, ketogenic, with a ton of and train 7 days a week. If you do that, you're guaranteed to fucking torpedo any androgen profile and any good testosterone you have.
It was very intense, and I probably wouldn't do that again. I was able to mitigate the effect of ketosis by manipulating the type of fats I was eating in my diet. So I was able to like buffer a bit of that natural like testosterone decrement that you have. But still like I kept doing intermittent fasting and I love it. It makes me feel great, but I quit on ketosis. I put in my good carbohydrates on a daily basis and my performance just went up like decently at least.
Yeah, no, when I retired from the NFL, I was in Dr. Amen's study on brain health. And the part of my brain that was damaged was over here on the left. And I reached out to a PhD buddy of mine, and he came back with a ketogenic diet, like 30% protein, 70% fat. And I, pretty much don't eat a carb. And he said it for a year. So I did that, and it was fucking awful. I can do it for a long period of time, but after a while, you're like, fuck, I just want to eat some carbs. And then when you do eat them, it's like a warm blanket wraps you up and somebody gives you a hug. So
I agree.
Anybody that's like, oh, I love living in ketosis. I'm like, I can do it. And I understand like the neurological effects and I felt better. But after a while, you're like, God damn, this is, it's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So.
And especially like there's some endurance athletes like triathletes or Ironman or whatnot that are still under the impression that if you train in a state of ketosis, so very low muscle glycogen, your body will eventually become better at utilizing fat. And if you can burn more fat, you can spare glycogen and you can run longer at a higher velocity in competition, which on paper makes absolute sense. And people have done that for years. If you read like there are research and papers out there that describe this approach to like hypoxia and with carbohydrates, they often refer to train low, compete high, which means train a low level of glycogen and then refeed and compete with higher glycogen levels. And again, on paper, it makes sense. But more recent studies have shown that if you do ketosis or you're in ketosis for too long, your muscles lose the ability to break down glycogen and use it for energy. So you might be able to store glycogen and you might be super compensating glycogen and you can refeed as much as you want. But then if your muscles can't break it down, it doesn't matter if you adapted to use fat, your performance is still going to be impaired. So even for extreme...
What do you think the mechanism is for the muscles to not be able to break down glycogen? I remember years ago reading some stuff about people coming out of ketosis where they were losing, I think it was losing bacteria or something within the gut that was like they were losing the ability to digest carbohydrates because they had been in ketosis so long that they no longer had like the gut biota to digest carbohydrate. I wonder if there's a factor for that in terms of the muscle. If there's a key, if all of a sudden you find the point where the muscles can't break down glycogen, like what's the mechanism, do you think, for that?
Oh, there is a mechanism. Like when glycogen, or actually glucose, is taken out from your bloodstream, put in your muscles and stored as glycogen, you need enzymes to be able to break down that glycogen and turns again into sugar or glucose and be able to use it. And enzymes, like anything else in your body, upregulate and downregulate. So if you condition your body to stay without those enzymes because you don't need those carbohydrates anymore, you're simply going to lose the ability to break down glycogen effectively. It's just normal adaptation that just recently proved to be the case if you do ketogenic diet for too long. So you might be able to, assuming that, because what you described in terms of like discomfort in digesting and absorbing carbohydrates is a fact, like you lose that microbiome that you need to digest and metabolize glycogen or carbohydrates effectively. But let's say that you can even buffer that and contain the damage and still be able to absorb that those carbohydrates in your bloodstream and then bring into your muscles to supercompensate glycogen. Well, if you have all that glycogen there, but when you go out for a run, you can't break it down, so you can't access it. It's like if you don't have it.
Sure.
So whether it's there or not is not going to affect your performance. And that's why ketogenic diet, there are still some athletes who are capable of performing at their best when they do ketogenic diet. But I think those are just those outliers who are not affected by average physiology. You know, we look at studies, we look at average across a very broad population. They're always going to be outliers. They're going to claim for the rest of their life, ketosis works great and works for everyone. It worked for them. But generally speaking, for the normal chunk of population that we deal with, it might be great for all the health benefit that comes with it, might be great for weight loss. But when it comes to anything that involves athleticism, is probably not the best way to go.
Well, man, I just read a bunch of studies looking at for body composition changes for those in ketosis versus the protein in the total caloric load was equated for athletes with carbohydrates. And the one thing that was interesting was that the ketogenic diets were beneficial in terms of losing fat. But I remember in the study, they didn't gain any muscle, whereas when the calories were equated the same, protein was the same, those with carbs actually gained muscle and lost fat. It was pretty interesting. And so like the conclusion of it was that ketogenic diets were extremely beneficial. They were muscle sparing. They're good at losing fat, but you're not going to gain any muscle on them. What is that clicking in my fucking headphones? Do you know what that is? Jesus, let's burn this fucking place to the. Sorry, I'm like, it's driving me crazy. I keep hearing this intermittent click in my headphones, which makes me just want to burn the whole fucking place to the ground. All right, sorry. But like, do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I apologize for that, but I try to oversimplify things the most I can. But the number one anabolic hormone that we need to grow muscle is insulin. And insulin is secreted in response to carbohydrate intake. So it doesn't matter how much protein you eat and how much you can save your muscles, you just prevent them from go to waste. If you don't have enough circulating insulin day in and day out, you're not gonna gain muscle. Like, you're not gonna gain muscle mass. So ketogenic diet simply can't work if your goal is to get buff and get big, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, protein does have a slight insulinic effect. And I only know that because my son's type 1 diabetic. And so he eats a very low carb diet is how we manage. I mean, he goes weeks without taking any insulin and is able to manage his type 1 diabetic. Now, he's not like, he's kind of in what they call the honeymoon stage where he still has beta cells that are working. But we manage his diet purely low carb. So he gets about 30 grams of carbohydrates split over 3 or 4 meals a day. He, eats, 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And, he's able to manage it pretty well. But it's interesting to look because he wears a CGM constant glucose meter. It's pretty interesting to watch, like, his blood sugar rise in response to not only different proteins. So it's different between, like, actually pork spikes him the least. Chicken being the most, steak being kind of like, if I take it out of the freezer and I cook it immediately, it's fine. If I put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours, spike him through the roof. So I think that's like a histamine effect. So we've dug in a bunch on that. But, at the most part, like you said, like, I think there was, people really vilified insulin as like this evil thing. I mean, and that was the Insulin Paradox, where you saw, who was it? Gary Taubes in the Insulin Paradox that, insulin high. I mean, even to the point where it makes sense, like for inflammation, when insulin is chronically high all the time, inflammation is going to be through the roof. But a healthy individual with a blood sugar of somewhere between, call it, I think, 80 to 90, is going to eat. They're going to get a spike and they're going to come down. And it's been pretty interesting because I don't have it on now, but I wore a CGM in parallel to my son to see, like, hey, I'm going to eat this and see what happens. And it's pretty interesting to lay my blood sugar on top of a type 1 diabetic's. Because, like, if I spike, I have a huge drop. Like, if I get to 140, I'm going to go down to 70. For him, he'll spike and just kind of stays there, and then it's real slow to come down just because his beta cells aren't as active. But, I mean, it's really, pretty true. I mean, if you ask any, like, we had Jay Cutler on there, I bet you he was eating 1,000 grams of carbohydrates a day. But it also helps, too, to have a really healthy antigen profile. I mean, there's some really cool, interesting research that talks about, like, high volume steroid use. Those guys can digest more protein because they're in constant protein synthesis, and they can just handle a higher volume of calories than they could if they didn't have a super antigen profile.
Yeah, metabolic flexibility. Your tissues need to be able to do what they need to do with what you give them. If they're not capable of metabolizing sugar to the extent that they should, then insulin does become a problem because, like you said, it's going to be chronically elevated. But if you spike it when you need it, and your body knows what to do with it and the sugar that comes with it, you're completely fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I do agree that some diets tend to be a bit too high in carbohydrates for some athletes. That tends to be the case. But nevertheless, going too low on carbohydrates is just as dangerous,
Yeah. No, the other one, you brought up a great point as you were talking about, like, these different endurance athletes thinking that if they stay in a ketogenic effect and their glycogen depleted, that their body will somehow use fat as a primary source. But that's just metabolic flexibility. And I did a talk for the NSCA on metabolic flexibility and did a way too deep dive in the literature, which was so conflicting. And really the only shred of truth that I found in it was that basically body composition is the greatest predicting factor for metabolic flexibility. The leaner you are, the more muscle you carry in response to fat, the more metabolically flexible you are, regardless of the diet that you eat. So it was pretty interesting I worked on that talk for a long, long time. And after reading all this research, there was so much confliction. Basically, the leaner you are and whatever you can do to be lean as shit and carry a high amount of muscle and respond in a low amount of body fat, Those are the most metabolically flexible people, regardless of what calories look like, regardless of what training looks like, regardless of the intent that I'm going to go out and do. If you're lean, you're metabolically flexible. If you're fat, you're not.
I 100% agree. And I would say lean body mass is probably the major contributor to metabolic flexibility, but also how active you are and how much you push your body to use that energy. And again, going back to science, instead of starting from science, if you look at the most recent literature on overtraining and overreaching in general, whether you're looking at strength and power athletes or endurance athletes, and whether you look at men or women, is the same. It comes out to the concept of energy availability, which is a fairly new concept in the literature, which is the amount of energy you eat minus the amount of energy you burn with physical activity divided by your lean body mass. So how active you are and how much muscles you carry. And every single study published so far shows that in both men and women, if you can preserve a level of energy availability above about 35 kilocalories per kilograms of lean body mass, your hormones are right where they're supposed to be, your metabolism is right where it's supposed to be, you perform at your best, you don't incur in any overtraining or overreaching, and you're capable of recovering. And very rarely you gain weight because everything is working out just fine. If those numbers end up being skewed because, again, your lean body mass changes or you're not as active, then your body becomes less flexible in using energy, and all the bad syndrome associated with overreaching and overtraining start to show up. So I 100% agree.
Is that because fat is so oxidative that when all of a sudden when there's too much fat within the body and your lean body mass drops and all of a sudden the ratio changes, that all of a sudden the fat becomes more oxidative and puts more stress on the system?
Yeah, and it becomes, again, chronic inflammation.
Do you think there's an ideal body fat
percentage?
Mm-hmm.
Yes and no. I would say yes because my ideal body fat percentage is the lowest you can sustain recovering well in your training process. So the leanest you can be without compromising your performance. I don't believe there's any benefit in gaining unnecessary fat, not even if you are a thrower or like a lineman or whatever the case may be. I think I would always take muscle over fat, no matter what and how much you weigh. If there's an optimal percentage, I think it's very much, there's too many confounding variables. It depends on too many things. But my take-home message is always the leanest you can be without letting diet to negatively affect your performance. Like if you want to be too lean, that becomes a problem too, because you might not have enough energy to train and recover and so far and so forth. There's an optimum compromise. And I think that's very much different from person to person and also from moment in your life, like early on in your career and later on in your career as an athlete, your metabolism will change, the way you adapt will change, aging eventually will happen, and your ideal body composition might change. But across the board, the leanest you can stay, the better you'll be in general, and the healthier you'll be in general.
So the media pushing the fit fat doesn't have any basis within science. Check. Yeah.
I mean,
I wonder.
We need a soundbite, Antonio.
No, like so I'll tee him up perfectly here. Where is like the cross section of like where you see on the news and this idea of like we have to create a more accommodating culture and we can't hurt people's feelings. And I was watching some people were like you can be fit fat, and I'm like, God, there's no scientific literature to support this. I mean, if we talk about metabolic flexibility and I mean, even anti-aging, it's pretty substantial that the longer you carry excess body fat, you age at a greater rate than those that don't. It's like in all these variables, like there's no variable where actually excess body fat is beneficial. I mean, as an offensive lineman, I know I came in too lean one year. I was 7.8% body fat in the bod pod at over 300 pounds. I was the only dude that ever tested over 300, sub 10%. And wow. we got a bod pad at the Eagles and we put like a bunch of money into a pot. And I think for like the last 6 weeks, it was like a cup of rice and like 400 grams of protein from ground beef. Like that's all I ate for like 6 weeks. Did like straight up bodybuilding diet and came in lean as shit. The only problem was when we went out there and hit, I started, I took a pretty good shot on my shoulder and my rib in practice. And dude, I bruised really bad. And I remember the doc's like, you need to put some body fat on. You're not going to survive. So, I mean, I think like, for offensive linemen, body fat, maybe some insulation or, maybe powerlifting or some strength sports. I mean, if you look at the Olympic lifter, like look at Lasha, like the guy that just, he snatched like 500 pounds. I mean, he carries a pretty significant amount of body fat, but it helps with his, I guess you could say his ratios, or maybe to be able to survive the load of having 500 fucking pounds crash underneath you or 600 pounds. But I think in terms of like longevity and health and performance for most athletes outside of Olympic weightlifting, professional football, maybe throwing, like excess body fat is oxidative and ages you and causes some other issues.
The answer I always give is the same. Like, there is no evidence to show that if you have more fat mass, you perform better. But there is plenty of evidence to show that if you have more fat mass, you're going to be less healthy over time. And that's how I put it. Now, of course, there's no like aesthetic dogma attached to it. You don't have to be lean and ripped to be good. Like, you can be at a normal physiological level of body fat and be okay for your body constitution. That shouldn't be a reason why our athletes get discriminated, whether they look lean or not. But to be healthy over a longer period of time, the leanest you can be at your body composition, the healthier you'll be, and the more likely. The way I look at it is like, if you're healthy, you can train longer. If you train longer, you get healthy over time. It's just a good cycle of things that happen. If you can stay in that active lifestyle even after your career as an athlete, I think you hit the jackpot. I mean, that doesn't get any better. You can slow down aging, you can prevent chronic diseases. There's so much good that comes with it. And I do agree, there are sports. We actually did a study a while back on weightlifters, and we found that women tend to respond, like if you look at just the individual predictors of performance in weightlifting, for women, lean body mass is a stronger predictor than sheer mass in general. Whereas for men, body mass still matters. Like, if you are bigger, just because of like sheer gravity and the load that you put on your system, you can tolerate more loads. But still, even being bigger, I think there's a limit at which like you can gain fat and still be okay. You should still be within at least the norm for your body type and body composition.
Well, big dogs don't live as long as little dogs. So something to always think about. Little dogs live to be 17, 18. Big dogs live to be 7, 8, or 10. So, I mean, there's definitely something to that. So where do you live out in LA?
We live in Long Beach,
Okay.
but USC is downtown Los Angeles, so I commute between Long Beach and Los Angeles.
Oh no, I grew up in Torrance, Palos Verdes. I'm from the South.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I went to school, high school in Palos Verdes, and all the kids I went to high school with were all, either went to USC, and I actually got recruited to go play football at USC, and then I went to Berkeley. So, and then I used to live in Orange County, so I know Long Beach, and believe me, I know the 405 freeway and the 110 very, very well. My dad went to USC Law School. So
this leads me to my last question, just a little bit fun. First off, amazing conversation. Lots of takeaways, definitely a re-listen on my part. You mentioned that you live in Long Beach to observe the racing, and then talked about Austin's got an F1. I'm curious, like, you grew up in the culture of racing, and now it's exploded in the U.S. all because of a Netflix that highlighted some racers and like actually got some character in there. Otherwise, U.S. is just NASCAR, where we go fast sometimes and then turn left. So like, what is help Americans understand the culture of racing and why it appeals to you so much that you choose to commute all the way to USC from Long Beach to live there and go to the freaking race once a year?
Now, Tex, in terms of the crows fly, it's not very far. Like Long Beach, like Long Beach to South Central, where we're down by the Coliseum where he's going. As the crow flies, is not very far.
Like, give me Texas reference.
It would be, man. I mean, it's got to be 14 miles. It's got to be easily 12, 13 miles, 14 miles.
Without traffic at 5 o'clock in the morning when I go is 19, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. With average traffic, it's easily over an hour.
Yeah. So, like if I would go drive where I was living in Newport Beach, if I would drive up the 405, I would go visit my mom at any other time other than the wee hours of the morning or late at night. It was 27 to 29 miles. It was a good 2.5, 3 hour drive. So it's funny. People here in Austin are like bitching about traffic. I'm like, until you sit on the 405 with 8 lanes either way and a fucking carpool lane for 3 hours,
I'm complaining about one stoplight that they just put in on my commute. It is bullshit, by the way.
Yeah, but I mean, like Long Beach has the Grand Prix.
That's what I'm referencing. Yeah. But he shared that he lived there because of the race.
Well, it's super cool. Have you never been? They actually race through Long Beach. Like, it's through the city.
Well, that's what I'm trying to. That's the question. Like, help us understand the appeal to this sport. Like in U.S., it was so simplified: go fast, turn left sometimes. But then, like F1 in Indy is tried like to explore different strategies in racing and making it challenging.
I think I've been asked that question quite a bit since I moved to the States, and I think the easiest answer for me is always the same. Like growing up in Italy, if I were to put in the same perspective for like American sports, the same way here we have American football and basketball as the baseball maybe as the predominant sports. If you grow up in Italy, it's either soccer or F1. And F1 is not just F1, it's just Ferrari. Ferrari is a question of national pride. When F1 is on, the entire country is watching F1. When Ferrari wins, the entire country is talking about Ferrari. On Monday morning after a race, every single magazine is talking about Ferrari. It's like you either love it or something is wrong with you if you live in Italy, you know? And
did you see Ford versus Ferrari?
Yes.
I mean, you can get a little bit of like the Ferrari arrogance.
I was rooting against him.
What? Oh, you mean the evil Italians?
Yeah, I mean, I was go Matt Damon. Let's go.
Yeah, with I mean, it was. I mean, there's been an ego. I mean, the amount of money. Like, so I always remember Jesse James told me something pretty good. He goes, "Not everybody could own a West Coast Chopper, but everybody could own a T-shirt." So that was where he made his money, selling West Coast Chopper apparel and merch. So like, not everybody owns a Ferrari, but like, I mean, I use Ferrari for an example in my talk on athleticism, in that I'm not necessarily a Ferrari fan, but if I hear a front engine V12 Ferrari pull up, I know exactly what it is and I can turn with just the sound. I always grew up a Porsche fan, so I've owned Porsches, but like a front engine V12 Ferrari, like that sound. And then they did an incredible documentary on the factory they built to build, what was it, the 599 Ferrari. I don't know if you saw the documentary, but to the point where like they take the motors in, they build them, and then they put them into a room and they tune them to the exact decibel that that Ferrari owns the patent on a certain sound.
What?
They paint
patent the sound.
Yeah. Literally, there's a signatures Ferrari sound of decibel that they have done research that elicits a response within the body similar to love. Oh, it's fucking it's unbelievable. That's why in my talk I use it where if I hear a front engine V12 Ferrari, and this has happened to me, I've stood on the street and I can hear it behind me, and I turn and I know exactly what car it is. And I'm not a Ferrari fan, and I know that sound. They painted the cars. They built an entire greenhouse, like with natural light and plants to paint the cars because they wanted to paint them in a natural environment because they couldn't get the color and the look they wanted in a paint booth. So they created a natural environment to paint the cars, like hydroforming the rails because they didn't want to weld. I mean, like, dude, the innovation and I thought to myself, man, like anytime I ever see the last of the manual transmissions was the 599 front engine Maranello. Every time, like if I'm on Facebook, I always kind of type in, I'm like 599. There might be one just sitting around that maybe some guy just wants to get rid of, and you're going to see me pull up in a black 599 Maranello front engine V12 Ferrari manual gearbox, and that would be.
It's got to make it through the driveway first.
That's part of a problem. We're probably going to have to get it paved because we live down a fucking dirt road. So I'll just give you a little history. Where we live here in Texas, there's a bunch of hills, and we have a huge creek in our backyard. Well, the problem is like all water flows downhill. So all the water flows down to our creek, and where our road is, we're kind of like in between, kind of like a wide, there's like it's called a dry creek. So like, or a wet creek, I think. That only runs when it really pours rain and actually runs through where our driveway, like the road to get to our house. So I've gone through and I've put road base and done all this shit. We get a big run, floods the whole thing out. So my next thing is when I'm going to put blacktop, and I'm actually going to pour concrete where that big hole is. And I'm going to have to literally pour concrete, and I'm going to
pour the Ferrari.
Yeah, specifically to find that Ferrari.
For the Ferrari.
Believe me. My brother's boss had a black 599 Maranello front engine V12 Ferrari manual gearbox, tan leather interior. Oh, dude, just the process of the leather for a Ferrari is unbelievable. There's a specific farmer that raises cows, and those cows, like, they don't use any barbed wire because they don't want them to like hit anything and mar the hide. And then there's a dude who his family has made all the hides for all the Ferraris. I mean, it's unreal. Then they take them, they tan them. There's a guy that goes and selects them. All those are all handmade. They don't push any of that out. It's all made within. I mean, dude, the attention to detail is like...
Did they do this the same with like the F1s?
Yes. Like it's the... like they always talk about like Swiss innovation and the Swiss watch. Dude, the Italians in terms of like Ferrari, and like the only people that are probably as insane as the Italians in that regard would be the Germans, like for Porsche. And like, you know, that's why in F1 it's like Ferrari versus Porsche and these other big people, because they have so much money to dump into.
Well, now I need to rewatch Ford versus Ferrari,
dude,
and like not be such an idiot American.
I gotta send you the documentary because you have to watch. Like this factory won like so many awards of innovation because they did so many things outside the box, and their attention to detail was so amazing. I mean, it's like I said, and I'm not necessarily a Ferrari fan where I feel like I have to own
national
one.
pride.
Yeah, like a national pride. But I respect attention to detail and innovation, and like more importantly, I always think it's weird that somehow in this country or even in the world, not necessarily in Italy, but like craftsmen and especially people that build cars, mechanics, whatever, are kind of viewed as like a more lower class, like blue collar. Whereas in Italy, like the guy that builds Ferrari or builds the motors for Ferrari, I mean, that guy's top of the heap. So.
And think about that too. Like every other sport, and it's the same in Italy for soccer, or in the States for American football.
What about bike racing? That's big in Italy too, isn't it?
It's big, but not as big as motorsport. Like Ferrari is one. There's not many Italian F1 teams. It's one, and when they win, the entire country goes nuts. If you Google Japanese Grand Prix of 2000 in Suzuka, is the year that Michael Schumacher won the World Championship after 23 years that Ferrari hadn't won a championship. That was broadcasted in Italy probably between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. The entire country was watching TV on like streets, bars, everywhere, up to watch Ferrari. Like it's part of our culture, and it's just as much as it's part of our history, because Ferrari was one of the leading forces after the Second World War to drive economy in Italy together with Fiat. So it's also a cultural thing. It's not just sport. Like when you walk through Maranello, when you walk through Modena, the entire city is paid as Ferrari employees. They make it. Ferrari gives a living to all these people living in the town where Ferrari is built. So it's just a question of pride for all of us. And I was obsessed with it since I was like, I don't know, 4 years old.
You know the story of Lamborghini, right? They made tractors.
Oh,
and
you've told me.
Yeah, the guy for Lamborghini like went to like have a Ferrari made, and like Enzo Ferrari made some comment about like basically made some flippant comment about his tractors, whatever, and it was so insulting that Lamborghini pivoted from tractors and started making cars.
But it's true.
Yeah,
is Lamborghini Italian?
Yeah.
Yes. And not many people know that Enzo Ferrari himself, he raced for Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo, which is a very popular brand in the States too, is actually older than Ferrari. And Ferrari started his own business building cars to compete against Alfa Romeo.
Yep. And then like the Ferrari has the horse, and then Lamborghini has a bull. So the idea was that so I mean, there's some really interesting history in this racing and the car stuff.
A spite car.
And I'm not a Lamborghini fan at all. So I mean, the only Italian car. I mean, one of these days I'll find that $599 Maranello. Oh God. I could see the look on my
Facebook
wife's
Marketplace.
Well, who knows? It'll
vision
pop
board.
Up. Yeah, I'll put it on my vision board. I just know my wife's. I'm married to an amazing woman. If I came home in that thing, I know she'd be like, "Huh, can I drive it?" So it was funny. I said to the dually, she's like, "Hey, can you move the dually truck? It's in the driveway." I'm like, "You move it." She's like, "Not today. Maybe later." Oh. I'm like, "Yeah, all right." So, well, dude, thanks so much for awesome. for coming on the podcast and helping us understand the research and just having an intelligent, amazing conversation, especially about Ferraris.
Thank you, guys. It was amazing. I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. Well, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Power Athlete Radio. But before we cut off, if anybody wants to get a hold of you because they want more information or they want to connect, how do people get a hold of you?
I think the easiest way is Instagram. I'm not very good with social media in general. And my Instagram page has either picture of my wife because she's gorgeous, my dog because she is very cute, or Ferrari. Doesn't have a lot of pictures of me, but it's my profile, it's my account. So it's Antonio _Squillante, yes. And everything I do with the NSCA is out there. Everything I publish in terms of abstract. Somehow I try to share that on social media on Instagram because I'm not very good. I don't go to Twitter because I think people like to fight too much on Twitter, and I'm not a big fighter.
So years ago, there was a really cool research article that came out that they related, like they went and they did like a whole bunch of like personality analysis on a bunch of men. And then they actually tested their androgen profiles and, testosterone, whatever. And what they equated was that the higher the testosterone, the easier and the more like happy-go-lucky guys were. So like kind of it broke the misconception. You think of like the angry, guy in the gym, high testosterone. Actually, the guys with higher testosterone were like more relaxed, easier to be around, and just generally like had a better sense of well-being. The guys who were real angry and pissed off and fighty and backbitey had lower testosterone. So in this blog post I did, I was like, when you meet somebody who's a pretentious asshole and a prick of like major, level, you need to pity him because he's probably got really low testosterone levels. When I get on Twitter, it just seems like a whole bunch of dudes with low testosterone levels backbiting each other in 140 characters, or is it 160? I can't remember.
I agree much.
Allegedly, I'm not.
Well, they upped it. It used to be 140 or 160, and now I think they've upped it. But it just, every time I get on there, I'm like, God damn it. First of all, how do people have this much time? And fuck, they seem petty as shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're very aggressive.
Very aggressive.
Well, again, Antonio, thank you very much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the premier podcast in strength and conditioning. Bye.